Welcome, everybody. We're recording this for our YouTube channel, so if you want to refer back to it later, you can. Welcome to the TAC Conference 2021, Transfer Survival. This particular session is thinking about emotional intelligence, how to apply emotional intelligence to your academic and transfer advising interactions. Our presenter today is Nora Mance. She is currently the Director of Advising, Transfer, and Articulation at Delaware County Community College. She's been with the college for almost 15 years, providing oversight and guidance to both the transfer and advising offices. Prior to coming to Delaware County Community College, Nora worked in admissions and financial aid, as well as counseling and first-year services for students. As a first-generation college student, Nora understands how education can provide access and mobility and strives to bring innovation, equity, and accessibility to her work. Nora has presented at almost every TAC conference and is a founding member of TAC, having served in a number of different roles over the years. So again, thanks for coming. If you wouldn't mind just making sure you're muted upon entry during the presentation, and if you want to drop some questions into the chat, that's fine too. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Nora Mance.
Thanks, Kim. I was going to say good morning, but it's the afternoon. So good afternoon, everybody. So thank you for joining me and joining TAC. This is a very innovative way of presenting our expertise. So I'm really excited to be part of this. Never thought that I'd be presenting at this conference in a virtual form, but it's pretty cool. So it's really great to be with everybody in a very socially distanced way. And from my house. So I say that to preface it with, my kids are home and my dog is here. So we never know what's going to happen. But we will get through this. So just welcome. Some housekeeping kind of guidelines, I suppose Kim already mentioned, just to make sure that you stay on mute. And just to kind of help the flow of everything, because I can't really see everybody, just to put your questions in the chat, and then Kim will help moderate them. I'm very much about being interactive, and you don't have to wait until the end to ask your questions. So just put your questions in the chat if you have any, and Kim will be sure to interrupt me so that I can help answer questions. In addition, I'd like to try and make this interactive. So I will be asking all of you, prompt you to answer some questions by putting your responses in the chat as well. And then just to talk a little bit about why this topic is important. So this topic is important to me for a variety of reasons, not just because I'm the Director of Advising at Delaware County, but because, academic advising, just advising in general, I know that we're also talking about transfer here, is really kind of the heart and the cornerstone to student retention. And so when we think about all that's happening just with the pandemic, and even in general, as we're seeing kind of the student bubble decrease, and we have more and more students that we are trying to retain, it's important to think about the services and resources that we offer that helps keep students with us. So this is why, for these reasons, this is important. And it's also very unique. We were talking a little bit earlier with our small group around emotional intelligence and how that's not really a topic that's typically used or discussed in higher ed. That's something that's really talked more about in the corporate world. So just because I like to try and be innovative, we're bringing this to higher ed. So here we go. All right, so screen is not, there we go. All right, so we're going to start with advising. So we'll talk about advising specifically, and then we'll talk about emotional intelligence, and then we will talk about the two of them combined. So in the chat, if you wouldn't mind just typing in when you think about advising competencies or advising skills or qualifications, what do you think about? What comes to mind to you? Is it caring? Is it knowledgeable? Is it friendly? So we'll give you a couple minutes to just put some words in the chat, and then I'll kind of read them and share them out loud. Great, so I'm seeing empathy and empathetic, listening, being supportive and non-judgmental, so active listening, being knowledgeable. Great. Understanding of individual student situations, absolutely, right? Forward thinking. These are great. Intuitive, considerate, being relatable. This is great. Other thoughts? Right. So challenging students in their beliefs, that's great too. Sharing knowledge. Yep. It's great. All right. So these are all perfect. You are all on key. And in fact, you may not have recognized it, but when we talk about it, what you shared overlaps with emotional intelligence as well. So being intuitive, caring, knowledgeable, all of those things. So we're covering advising competencies and emotional intelligence competencies. So you guys are already doing great. All right, so when we look at academic advising, and I know that we are at the TAC conference, which is transfer, and you all know that transfer is also, something that I love. So when I talk about academic advising, I also am covering advising in general, right? So I say advising, say academic advising, it also is referring to transfer advising. So a lot of what we do in an advising session, whether it's academic or transfer, they're all very similar. They're all very transferable skills. So, just keep that in mind as I'm speaking to this, but also to know that really there's nothing in the literature around transfer advising, whereas academic advising has NACADA, which we'll talk about, and there are competencies around academic advising, but there really haven't been any competencies set around transfer advising. So this is why I'm kind of using this information for both areas. All right, so when we talk about academic advising, I think it's important to kind of set the foundation and provide a little bit of history. But in the last several decades, advising has grown. It isn't just what we call prescriptive and informational, it's moved on to what is also called developmental. And I'll go over what those two basically definitions mean to advising. I mentioned earlier why this is important, because research shows that advising is one of the most impactful interventions to helping retain students, to helping engage students, to helping them persist, and also to graduate. When we think about advising, we always like to have a term, a concept, a definition, right? So for me, academic advising is conceptualized as the interactions between a student and an advisor, during which students participate in developing basically their academic, their personal career, and also social skills. And we don't think about that when we think about academic advising, but social skills is also very key, right? There's an interactive piece in the dyad of academic advising, of the advisor-advisee. And all of these are help or enable the student to be much more successful in their academics and in their academic journey. So I'm going to provide you a little bit of history. I had a colleague who I showed this to, and once they saw the word Civil War era, they laughed. And so it is a kind of a strange thing to have in a session around academic advising, but I think providing a little bit of history around academic advising is important. So it essentially began as sort of this informal task that was conducted by the college's president. It typically, what the research shows is that it started at Harvard. That was one of the first colleges. And so the president was responsible for providing all things academic advising. Because they were responsible, remember schools were smaller then, they were responsible for the students' education and well-being, specifically to the parent. Right now we have all these laws around what we can share about your student in the classroom, in admissions, and so on in higher ed. That wasn't necessarily the case back then. And so the college presidents will report back to parents how their children were doing. And we don't even refer to college students as children anymore, but they did back then. So eventually, as more and more individuals returned to school, faculty started to take over responsibilities of academic advising. And the first system of faculty advisors began at Johns Hopkins University in the 1800s. And then advising shifted again. So during the Civil War era, there was really a great impact on higher ed. We had a lot of GIs and soldiers come back from war, and they wanted to go to school. And so institutions increased in their number and their type because we had students who were going back to school who wanted specific kind of training. And then this is where we saw the Morrill Act, where we had land grant institutions. A lot more schools started adding different curriculum. We started to see state, private, and women-based colleges as well. And so as the student population increased, it really brought around this shift in academic functions. And then advisors were hired and appointed to support students and their academic needs as well as their personal needs. And as we saw more and more students returning, we also saw this proliferation of different majors happening. And because there were all these different majors, it wasn't just philosophy or medicine or Latin, right? There were so many other things that students could now study. Advisors had to really be knowledgeable of all of the different curricula, the different electives, the different options that students had. And then in the 60s and 70s, we really started to see another shift around academic advising. Advisors were more professional advisors versus not just faculty or the college president. And our advisors were helping students with, again, their academic, their personal, and now their vocational or career needs. And so this gave way to really a personalized advising, where students were being recognized more as individuals with unique needs instead of like this sort of concept of group advising. You're all being advised around this one topic just because there's not a lot else to discuss except for these several classes that you have to take. Then in the 70s, there were a number of professional advisors who would get together, similar to what TAC has been doing over the last decade, where they would talk about their challenges and the uniqueness of their responsibilities. And that's how NACADA was formed, which was called the National Academic Advising Association and is now called the Global Community for Academic Advising. And the NACADA, the conversations around NACADA really helped to kind of spur this idea of advising as a professional career. And out of that, their research started to happen. Theories around student development were implemented when we talk about academic advising. And this concept of prescriptive and developmental advising happened. And so prescriptive advising, I'm going to move on to the next slide, but I didn't do a slide for prescriptive advising because it's essentially registration, right? A student comes in, you look at their degree audit, it's called something different at every institution, and you see that a student needs English composition and a science and a math. And you look at what they need, you suggest the classes, you look at the times when they're offered, whether it's in person or hybrid or virtual, and you register the student, right? So that's what prescriptive advising is. It's very task oriented versus developmental advising, which goes beyond this concept of registration and scheduling. This is looking at the student more holistically and looking at what their educational experiences are, what they need, looking at where they're at in terms of the coursework, what their end goal is, and employing interpersonal interactions, looking at how the advisor is interacting with the student, how the student is interacting with the advisor, helping students problem solve. Advising is also looked at as teaching, because when we think about it, we are teaching students how to be a student. That happens in the classroom, but that also happens with advising. And that happens in academic advising, that happens in transfer advising. In transfer advising, we're helping students learn how to be a transfer student. What does that mean? What does it mean to interact with an admissions counselor? What does it mean to apply for scholarships potentially? And so we are really teaching students how to take onus of their education and be responsible for learning how to be a student, but also what they need in order to graduate, for example. All right, so developmental advising also looks at advising as a relationship that is developed between the student and the advisor. And that's really key, because that's been shown to help with student engagement and persistence. We all know that when students feel like they can trust somebody, or they feel like they have somebody who is kind of their champion, they are more apt to staying with the institution and graduating or completing their degree. All right, so I'm going to keep going. I don't see that there are any questions unless there are. Okay. All right, so we talked about, oh my goodness, I wrote NACAC in there instead of NACADA. So this should say NACADA. I've looked at this so many times, but so NACADA, the Global Community for Academic Advising, we talked about the fact that they came together and created this organization that looked at academic advising. And what they discovered is that there are essentially 3 areas of competencies that academic advisors should be aware of, or should have, or should know. And so the 3, you could see, I borrowed this circular graphic here from NACADA's website, but the 3 areas of competency are conceptual, informational, and relational. So we're going to talk about each of those somewhat briefly. So the conceptual suggests that ideas and theories, these are ideas and theories that advisors must understand in order to work with students effectively. And again, these are ideas and theories, right? So the history and role of academic advising in higher ed. Any relevant theory to advising, we're thinking about student development theory, right? Things like Chickering. We're looking at academic advising approaches and strategies. So there's different ways there's different concept around advising. There's appreciative advising. So these are the kind of different approaches that I'm referring to. And then the expected outcomes of advising. And I think very few advisors will go into an advising session with an expected outcome. I think we oftentimes take the lead of the student. So we don't go in having sort of this preconceived notion that we're going to just advise the student, everything's going to be wonderful. We tend to really follow the student's lead, but have sort of a broad understanding of what we want to do in our advising session. Then there's the informational. And this is just what it sounds like, informational, the institutional knowledge. So does the advisor understand the mission and the vision and the values and the culture of that institution? Because all of those things impact students. Do they understand the curriculum and the degree requirements, right? Have they read the student handbook the same way that we are asking students to read the student handbook? Do they know what this course repeat policy is? Do they know what's required to have a dual degree? It's those details. And at some institutions, that's very, very complicated. And as a result, there are advisors that are specific to either a curriculum, an academic discipline, a pathway, right? Like health education. And what does that mean? And all of the majors that fall within like a health ed or a health studies major. And then other policies around ad drop, payments, withdrawals, things like that. And then also understanding emerging student populations. 20 years ago, we didn't really talk about DACA. We didn't really talk about first generation students. And we are talking about that now, which is very, very important. And that is really what it means when they say emerging populations. And then technology that's relevant to advising. We all have to use technology in some form or fashion when we're advising students. And oftentimes that changes, right? There's upgrades. We want to make sure that we're staying on top of that so that we can advise and help and register students to the best of our knowledge with the technology that's been given to us. So the last piece, or the last competency that NACADA suggests is relational. And this is really key. So I'm going to talk about relational quite frequently when we're talking about emotional intelligence here, because this is where a lot of the alignment comes in. And so these are the skills that an advisor needs to kind of help relay the information from the conceptual and informational competencies that we just learned about to their advisees. So the relational is about creating rapport. It's about building the relationship between the advisor and the advisee. And we talked earlier about how important that is. It's about communicating in an inclusive and respectful manner. Being aware that students that come to see us are all, they're very different. Not one student is the same. And I think some of you had mentioned something of that in the chat, which is great to see. And then we want to plan and have really successful advising interactions, right? It is not quickly, it's not like a counter where students are coming in, you're seeing them and then off they go. We really want to be intentional about how we are interacting with our students when they are with us in our advising session. And then I'm not going to read through all these specifically, but we want to definitely help to facilitate problem solving. We want to help teach students how to problem solve, how to make decisions, right? While we want students to come to us for advising, whether it's academic or transfer, we also want to teach them how to make the decisions on their own. So we're helping them understand how to read their degree audit, for example. How do you plan? For us at the community college, students they hear 2 years and they think they're going to graduate in 2 years, but they're taking 2 classes at a time. So the math doesn't add up. If you're taking 6 to 7 credits at a time and your degree requirements are 60 credits or 62, that doesn't add up to 2 years, right? So it's helping to inform students about, that it would take you at a minimum 15 credits a semester to be able to reach 60 in 2 years, which means that you may have to take a summer class or 2 or a winter course, right? So that's what we talk about, this idea of problem solving, okay? So I also left, because I know that this is being recorded and people could utilize this PowerPoint later, I did leave the resource for the competencies down on the bottom here. All right, so let's move into talking a little bit about emotional intelligence. But when we're comparing emotional intelligence around the discussion of academic advising or advising in general, I just wanted to show you how relevant the two are. So emotional intelligence has been linked to maintaining positive interpersonal relationships. And if we think back to the relational competencies, creating rapport and building relationships was one of the first bullets around the relational competencies that NACADA is suggesting. And then we've learned that positive interpersonal relationships are really the key to successful advisor and advisee relationships, which then lead to engagement and persistence, which leads to retention, which leads to graduation. So, I hope that you're all seeing how I'm trying to string this together, but this is why emotional intelligence is important to academic advising. So we're going to ask you to do another activity to kind of get you all up out of your seats a little bit. So when you think about emotional intelligence, just type in the chat what comes to you when you think about emotional intelligence competencies. And some of you wrote earlier, empathy, listening. So those types of things are what I'm asking. So I'll give you a couple of minutes while I drink some water to type some things up in the chat. So I have understanding one's emotions, being mindful, being grounded, self-awareness, great, emotional regulation, controlling emotions. This is great. Being balanced, focusing on other people and not just yourself. Right? Emotional intelligence, that's called service. How information is processed. Yep, relational, right? How we're processing emotions and information that's coming to us and how that's affecting us. That's great. You all already know this. This is great. All right. So keep going if there aren't any other questions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about emotional intelligence. So EI or EQ, emotional quotient, there's different names for it. People call it different things. In the field of research is fairly what they call sort of in its infant stage, although it's been studied for several decades now. And there are a variety of definitions around emotional intelligence. But in the middle here, what I really like around this idea of emotional intelligence is this concept or this definition that it's the ability to recognize and process one's own emotion, one's own and others' emotional information. Some of you wrote that in the chat, and to use these emotions effectively, as well as the knowledge to enhance thought. And that is both your own and the individual that you're interacting with, to problem solve. And if you all remember back to the informational competencies, this idea of problem solving was in there, and to regulate behavior. And this is regulating your own behavior. It's not necessarily regulating somebody else's behavior, right? So being mindful of your own emotions. And essentially, there are two models of emotional intelligence. There's this concept called the ability model, and then the trait model, which is oftentimes also called the mixed model. So we'll talk a little bit about those two models as well. So the ability model is what it sounds like, right? It's a set of abilities that allows a person to understand and to respond to the emotions of themselves and others as well. So this idea of like regulating your emotions and knowing how you are responding to other people based on how you're feeling, and how their interactions with you are making you feel, okay? And it's the capacity to perceive, express, to understand and analyze, and to assimilate emotion into thought. Again, you know, this is what you're feeling, but this is how it's coming across. All right, so are there any questions? It's pretty straightforward, right? Okay. So again, the trait or mixed model, it's this idea of a conglomeration, basically, of disposition, somebody's disposition, their perceived emotions, like what they think they're feeling, what they're actually feeling, their abilities or their skills, their competencies, and also personality traits, because personality traits, we have to consider that when we're thinking about our own emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence isn't an intelligence the way we think about academic intelligence, right? It's this idea of something that your person, your emotions are capable of doing. And there's higher levels of emotional intelligence and lower levels of emotional intelligence. And they're not fixed. So you can definitely learn how to increase or improve your emotional intelligence. Now, again, there are various concepts around trait and mixed models of emotional intelligence, but the one that we're going to talk about today is by Daniel Goleman. And he defines there are four dimensions of emotional intelligence that are separated in two areas of competence. And we're going to talk about that. It's personal and social. And we'll look at each of those areas and then talk about how academic advising, or how they're related to academic advising. So it's a cross-section of emotional and social competencies. And again, sort of another definition that I think is important that I wanted to share is specifically for this trait or mixed model is how we effectively understand and express ourselves, how we understand others, how we relate to them, and how we cope with daily demands. And I think this last year and a half has definitely taxed our coping of daily demands. Okay, so I know there's a lot of information on this slide. Didn't want to have too many slides, so I tried to kind of put everything together here without it being too overwhelming. So personal competence, right? We talked about two specific domains, and these are capabilities that determine how we manage ourselves. So emotional intelligence is about how we manage ourselves and how we interact with others, right? The social piece of it. So within the personal competence, there's self-awareness and self-management. And I won't read these word for word, but when we're looking at self-awareness, we're looking at emotional self-awareness, right? So being able to interpret and understand our own emotions and recognize how they're impacting what we do, and others as well. And it's also this idea of like a gut sense, right? Like our self-awareness, oftentimes you hear people say like, I feel it in my gut. And then it's this idea of accurate self-assessment. So knowing your strengths and knowing your limits. And that's really, I think, important in academic advising, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the next couple of slides. And then self-confidence, right? So having a sense of your own self-worth and your capabilities, and how that is relayed to other people in your communication with them. And then we look at self-management. So emotional self-control, how we're able to keep our emotions under control in situations. And this is important when we're working with students, because we know students come with so much to us. Sometimes we as advisors, both academic and transfer, in admissions, in financial aid, are perhaps the only people that they feel comfortable speaking to. And sometimes with that comes the ability to just sort of be themselves, right? And they can't control their emotions, so they're coming to you with all of this stuff. And I like to tell students sometimes when I meet with them, like, I try and point that out and just say, like, I'm feeling very flustered right now. Like, are you flustered? Because I feel like there's some things happening. And then they'll open up and say, yes, I'm very overwhelmed, or whatever it is, right? So this ability to say, like, what is happening here? And then being transparent. I can't tell you how important it is to be, not to lecture, but to be honest, and to be trustworthy. Students can sniff that out. They can tell right away if you really don't have their best interest at heart. They can tell just by your body language, just by how you're interacting with them, the things that you're saying, how much time you're taking to talk to them. And so it's incredible how they're able to really identify when somebody is really not being honest or trustworthy, and looking out for their best interests. And then being adaptable. We know being in higher ed, particularly now, requires so much adaptability. We all had to adapt on a dime when we went from in-person to virtual. So being flexible, a student will come into your office or your space and say, you know what, this isn't what I want to do. I want to change my major. Now, what are my classes? What do I need to do? And so being able to adapt to these kind of switching situations is important. And then achievement. So improving performance and sort of meeting your inner standards of excellence. And, this is less about the advising piece, but more about yourself. Like, what am I doing to improve my advising competencies? Am I doing professional development? How am I managing myself around this career? Okay. Taking initiative and then being optimistic. And I think optimism, and I try to not necessarily wear only the community college hat, but we see a lot of students in this day and age who really are undergoing a lot of challenges. And so being optimistic is really important, because like I was saying earlier, you may be the one person that they come to. You're their cheerleader. And we'll talk about this a little bit later too. So before I get ahead of myself. So let's go on to the social competence. So these capabilities determine how we manage relationships, right? This is sort of the forward-facing piece of emotional intelligence. And this is broken up into social awareness and relationship management. So under social awareness, there are basically three areas. So there's empathy, organizational awareness, and service, this concept of service. And empathy, you all know what that means, right? It's being able to sense others' emotions, being able to understand and see their perspective, and maybe not necessarily understanding completely, but understanding they have a different perspective and taking that into consideration when working with them. And then organizational awareness, right? So here it says reading currents, decision networks, and politics at your organization. But when we think back to the NACADA competencies around informational, this is where this is really important, is being aware of the organization, right? Like, what is the structure like? who do you go to for questions or problems or concerns? Who do students go to? And I think that's really important. If you don't have an answer for a student, how do you help them find the answer? How do you get the answer and then give it to them? And being aware of your organization is key to that. And then this concept of service. And in some form or fashion, we are interacting with students, and there is a level of customer service. And so understanding that we have to provide a customer service component to what we do when we do advising for students is important as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. So if we move on to the relationship management, and there's a couple of competencies here, right? So being an inspirational leader, providing influence, and that's not, here it says using a range of tactics for persuasion. So that sounds so aggressive, but that's not really what we're talking about when we talk about advising and influencing students, right? Influencing them is influencing them about, they want to pursue a specific career, but they have been taking the same classes for the last 3 years and not successful. So how do we influence them? How do we persuade them to see that perhaps there are other opportunities, other career paths for them, right? That's what we think about when we think about this term influence. And then developing others. That's our role as advisors, right? So helping to bolster their abilities, helping them to see where their strengths are to help them build on those strengths. And then being a change catalyst, right? Like we are the individuals that are helping them transition from wherever their current situation is into the next career path or educational path. And then conflict management. We'll talk a little bit about this later too, but resolving disagreements. So when we think about that, you're like, well, I'm an advisor. How am I resolving disagreements for students? But we do have students that come to us to express their frustration with the professor that they have or the grade that they received. And so again, this idea of being an advisor as a teacher, we're teaching them how to manage some of these conflicts, who they should speak to, how to interact with their professor, how they should write an email to their professor, right? So this is this concept of conflict management. And then teamwork and collaboration. And I think we need that regardless of whether we're advisors, whatever we're doing, right? We have to cooperate, work, collaborate with each other, but then with our students too, right? We want them to know that they can come to us to be able to talk about what their concerns are. And this is this idea of teamwork. So I'm going to move on, and this is the piece in which we're going to be applying our emotional intelligence to advising. Are there any questions? I see nothing in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves. All right. So let's look at emotional intelligence and the social competence. So we see these 3 boxes at the top, and these are all emotional intelligence competencies. And so what I want to show you is how they lead to this circle on the bottom that's academic advising, right? So as advisors, we need to be self-aware. We talked about this, a couple of slides ago, right? We need to recognize our own emotions. Are we frustrated? Are we tired? Are we hopeful, right? When we're working with students. And this leads to self-awareness for creating relationships or building rapport or helping to communicate and be respectful of students as they're working with us and we're working with them. Self-assess your own strengths and your limits. We talked earlier about, if you don't know something, where do you go to get answers? How do you help students find these answers as well? And knowing that this is what you know, and maybe this isn't what you know, and that's okay too, because this idea of growth, you're going to learn it eventually. And then having self-confidence by knowing your own self-worth and capabilities, right? Like what can you do to improve upon your advising capabilities to help students so that they are growing kind of in their own personal arena, but also in their academic and career, right? If we think back to the NACADA competencies around advising, it's about helping students with their academic, personal, and career and social skills as well. Okay. Let's look at some more emotional intelligence competencies. So we're looking at, again, the boxes at the top are all leading to these relational competencies. as defined by Nakata. So emotional self-control, right? Keeping disruptive emotions and impulses under control. Maybe you had a bad day. Maybe the student you just met with was really frustrating. How are you recognizing that? And how are you using the emotional self-control so that you can then move into this circle of helping to build rapport and helping to communicate with students, helping them to plan their advising going forward, right? Like what will be their educational plan going forward? We talked about transparency and being honest and trustworthy, right? Being genuine. Students can see right across that. So think about that as you're interacting with them. You know, maybe you don't agree necessarily with the path that the direction that they're going to, and have a conversation with them about that. Just say, you know, I'm really worried about the decisions that you're making, and here are my concerns. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are around that, right? It's about how we're also communicating with the student. And then taking initiative to seize the moment, to seize opportunities. And when I think about that in terms of advising, this is this concept of building relationships and building rapport. You know, how can we help students seize opportunities, whether that is through a co-op, whether that is through research opportunities with faculty, whether that is getting a work study job on campus, for example, right? So this is this concept of seizing opportunities to help students. And, you know, I don't know how many of you were at Sandra's presentation yesterday, but they really talked a lot about the great work that they were doing around workshops and development for students. And so they were able to really look at what students' needs they had and then meet them where they were at. And they really seized this opportunity to help educate students and to provide opportunities for students to have a platform to speak up. So even though we're not thinking about ourselves as advisors at that point, we still are advisors, and we're helping to grow students' sort of self-esteem, their capabilities, their skills, and so on. And then we're optimistic. And I think this is really important, particularly when we're working with students. Oftentimes we have students who aren't doing so well in school or who have other personal issues. And while we are not to be counselors for students, there are specific responsibilities that are held by others, and academic advising is not seen necessarily as counseling. And we know that they do overlap, so I'm definitely not saying that they don't. But we need to be optimistic about the experiences that students are going through and helping them understand that while it's challenging now, perhaps these are the things that they can learn coming out of this situation, or being optimistic about their grades and what they can do to improve it, okay, or improve them, I should say. And then being adaptable and flexible in your interactions with students. So I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but frequently a student will email you that they want to come in and talk about something, or will set up an appointment to talk about transferring to one university, and they come in and they're like, actually, I changed my mind, and I changed my major, and I changed my school. And so how are we being flexible? How are we adapting? How are we, you know, kind of controlling our own emotions around frustrations? Let's say it took you 30 minutes to prepare for this appointment for the student who wanted to transfer an X major at Y institution. Now they're changing it, and you're like, I spent all this time. What are you doing? How are you being adaptable? How are you now interacting with the students so that they feel like you're communicating effectively, that they are being included in the conversation, and you're not sort of just saying, well, I can't help you anymore, right? That's not our responsibility as an advisor. So learning how to be adaptable is key when we're advising both academic and transfer as well. So now when we look at, remember there were the two sections, right? The personal and the social. So when we look at social, we had, and I didn't, just for time's sake and to not give you all too much to read, I didn't actually put every single thing that falls under these social awareness or social competencies, but these that are, I think, relevant to advising. So empathy. I think several folks put empathy when we talked about advisor competencies early on in the chat, and then empathy around emotional intelligence. So you can see, I put it here, maybe I should have bolded it, but empathy is at the heart of advising. Again, whether it's academic or transfer. And empathy helps to build the rapport and the relationship between the advisee and the advisor. This is where you're taking an active interest in the student. You may be able to sense, right? This goes back to that gut intuition. You may be able to sense that something's happening. How can you be empathetic to the student? How can you relate to them without perhaps necessarily understanding, because we don't all walk in our students' footsteps, but how can we empathize with what they're going through? And then how can we help them? Organizational awareness, right? We talked about this earlier, and I put NACAC again. I think, maybe, Freud's in my head somewhere here. But organizational awareness overlaps with NACADA's informational competencies, right? So understanding program and curriculum requirements. We discussed this a couple of times earlier, but I wanted you to see how the emotional intelligence around social awareness and organizational awareness aligns with NACADA's informational competencies. And then this concept of service, right? So meeting students where they're at. And this overlaps with the concepts of informational and relational competencies as described by NACADA, right? We don't necessarily use the word servicing students, but we provide a service to the students, and we have to meet them where they're at and also know where they need to go, right? And that's part of our service. That's part of our work, is knowing how to help students, become autonomous, take responsibility, ownership, and then even if they want to advise themselves and come back to you, that's part of what we do when we're talking about service and helping students learn. This last slide around social awareness or social competency. Again, as we're aligning emotional intelligence with academic advising, we think of this concept around relationship management, which includes being an inspirational leader, providing and using influence, which we looked at a little bit earlier, and then developing others by helping to bolster student abilities through feedback, through guidance, through having students say, well, this is what I need. This isn't really helpful. This was not helpful. I had an advisor who did or did not do this, and that wasn't helpful. So then how are we then leading students to provide what it is that they need that would be helpful for them? Because what we think is helpful may not necessarily be helpful for them at that moment. And then advisors are also considered a change catalyst, right? Like we work with students to help them improve and move in a different direction. And again, bringing it back to transfer, choosing a transfer school, choosing a major, choosing a course, understanding how to use the different resources at your institution, whether it's tutoring, whether it's financial aid, whether it's speaking to your professor because you don't understand a concept, right? So that's where we help with that change. And then often advisors help students to navigate the conflict between peers and or instructors. So I don't know if you've had these situations, but there are students who come to us and say, I don't have a great relationship with this faculty member or this teacher of mine. What do I do? And then we talk to the students about how to manage that relationship, right? So it's, again, relationship management, not just between you and the student, but helping teach students how to manage relationships with others and how to get through this like conflict resolution. And then teamwork and collaboration. And teamwork and collaboration, again, is not just between you and the student, but it's also teamwork and collaboration with your peers and your colleagues as well. Okay, so we're going to move on. And again, I'm going to engage you all, just kind of thinking about time. So I'm going to engage you all a little bit around advising competencies. So if you don't have to put this in a chat, but we can talk about it. If you want to raise your hand, you have some ideas around how would you use or how would you plan to use some of these emotional intelligence competencies that I've been going over in your advising meetings. And when I talk about advising, think about that more broadly, because sometimes when in admissions, we don't necessarily look at it as advising, but perhaps you can consider advising from an admission standpoint, from a financial aid standpoint, academic or transfer advising as well. So if anybody wants to speak up or you want to put it in the chat, that would be great too. Thoughts? Did I go through it too quickly? Come on, folks. I know you can do this. We can't go on without this. So you're probably doing a lot of this already, right? And you just didn't call it emotional intelligence. You just didn't go into your advising session saying like, I'm wearing my emotional intelligence hat today. You're not doing that because we're not really taught about utilizing emotional intelligence in advising. So this is also potentially a new concept for everyone. So there is something in the chat where someone mentioned, being understanding that there are also maybe full-time students and they have a life outside of transferring. So give them time and resources. Absolutely, right. We forget about that, right? So this traditional concept of going to college is around going full-time, but that's not necessarily the case anymore. So being mindful of what the students are experiencing outside in their life, right? Then there's this idea here of understanding their budget, their timeline, and their story to make the best plan for them in conjunction with the institutional knowledge and any loopholes that may be there at the institution. Okay. So really this idea of empathy, of understanding what the students are going through that's different than maybe something that you're experiencing or other students are experiencing. So we have that some students might have hidden disabilities that we're not privy to. It's great. And that this may be why some of the advising sessions or interaction are a little bit more challenging. Absolutely. This is a great point, Laura. We still, there's such a stigma around individuals with disabilities. And while we are making a little bit of progress, it's not where it should be. And so students may be afraid of that, or may not even be knowledgeable that they're experiencing a disability and or have a disability. And so how do we interact with students in those situations, right? How do we help them feel comfortable, but also bring it up? How do we communicate with them? Absolutely. So sort of being mindful of your own emotions and your own self and some of the challenges that you're experiencing interacting with students. That's great. Are there any questions around this? Like, I know you put some of these up here, but are there any specific questions too we can address? And I see that Sandra put in from the community college perspective. So encouraging students, the imposter syndrome, very good. That may not lead them to consider options outside of their experiences. Absolutely, absolutely. So we have students who maybe are first generation or have experience with attending school, but maybe did not do as well. And so what are they struggling with, right? To a certain extent, we all have imposter syndrome, whether we want to believe it or not, in certain situations. And so how are we working with those students? How are we being empathetic to them? How are we helping to provide a service, right? Which is resources, which is maybe some readings, which is helping to educate them around this idea of imposter syndrome and how they can see outside of that as well. This also makes me think about when students looking at transfer schools and they look at the tuition, which is typically like sticker shock, right? And we give this, at least I do give this example of buying a car. I mean, I haven't bought a car lately. It's been many years, but you go to the car and you're like, I'm not paying that. And students need to understand that what they typically see on the website is not what they will necessarily pay, because there are scholarships, there's financial aid, right? So this goes back to the informational competency around being knowledgeable and knowing how to share appropriate information with students. And if you're not aware, how do you educate yourself to bring that information to students? So this is great. So Sandra has a question of how can we use the information in this workshop to help improve the transfer institution's ability to become more transfer supportive, not just transfer friendly. So do you want to chat a little bit about that? Do you feel like you want to unmute yourself, or is that question good enough?
I think the question's good enough. I think that many of us, we had a wonderful workshop yesterday from St. Joseph's University, and they talked about how they try to do the best that they can as an office, be personalized. But I'm curious, outside of an admissions office, for example, outside of a registrar's office, is the institution truly transfer supportive, not just transfer friendly? In other words, not just, oh, it's great to have a transfer student, but at the end of the day, the student is not able to succeed because they are not getting the kind of supports that they need,
Right.
Not just in advising, not just in admissions, but faculty, etc. So I'm just looking at it from an institutional perspective.
Right.
And just throwing that out there.
No, and that's a great point. And I think some of it, the onus just falls on that institution as well. Like, I think it's challenging, particularly from the community college standpoint, to be able to go in and request these changes to be made. But I do think that there are institutions that are seeing that. And, to call out on Westchester, who has created a transfer concierge position, right? So this, I think, goes, Sandra, from your this concept of transfer friendly to transfer supportive. And this individual really has one-on-one interactions with students around what they need to do, right? It's not just about, okay, did you do your application? Did you complete FAFSA? Did you meet with your advisor to make sure that you're registering? But it's more like, well, did you apply to the community college to graduate so that you can receive the academic passport and have your general education credits awarded? What kind of help do you need around housing? Right? Let me put you in touch with maybe somebody in our student housing division to talk about how you can assimilate into student housing, whereas you weren't doing that before, right? So I think there's that, where four-year institutions, I think the onus really has to fall on institutions themselves and leadership to decide to be not just transfer friendly, but transfer supportive. But I think the other thing that we can do is continue the relationships that we have. I know personally, and I know that you do as well. I know that a lot of our folks on here, and particularly because of TAC, we all have really good relationships with our partner or transfer institutions, particularly in our area, because at least for a lot of us, that's where students tend to stay. And so I think continuing, having that open line of communication, trying to express and explain the challenges that some of our students are experiencing and why we need their support in the transition for students is important as well. And so this is less about trying to improve the emotional intelligence of the four-year, but looking at our own emotional intelligence and how are we leveraging that to maintain that open line of communication with our partner schools so that it can help students as they transition. So I'm not sure if I answer your question or if anybody else has any other thoughts, but it is a key question here around how we can be, and even at the community college, transfer supportive versus transfer friendly, because we also see transfer students. What are we doing to help them transition? Are we requiring them to take a placement test, even though they have transcripts? Like, what are we doing as institutions to help students as well? So it's a great question. Others, thoughts or questions? All right, so, as we wrap up, I just wanted to provide some takeaways. I mean, there was interaction, and I appreciate you all sharing your thoughts here. So just to share again that student situations are unique. And thankfully, advising has been aware of that for the last couple of decades, where that wasn't necessarily the situation very early on in the early colleges. And part of that is because there wasn't a lot of diversity, right, in terms of who was attending these colleges, who was participating. And so now we're seeing, thankfully, more and more diversity in education. And when we work with students, it's really not, there can't be a blanket around how we're working with every single student. They're unique. So approach it with empathy, approach it with leadership, approach it with influence. And again, influence in terms of supporting students, not being like directive, like this is what you need to do, but talking to them about why doing that specific thing is important. And then remaining optimistic, right? Being adaptable. We talked about that. They come in, they have one thought in mind, and then they come in and something else happens, and how are we shifting? And being honest and trustworthy. Again, I think that's very important because that's how we build that rapport and the relationship with our students. And that's actually what helps to bring them back. That's what maintains the engagement, and that's what leads to persistence. A lot of the research has shown that really that relationship between the advisor and the student helps with persistence and retention. And then managing your own emotions. How are you responding when you're having a difficult day? How are you interacting with students? Because they can see that as well. And there are times where, you dropped your pen, your papers fell out of your hand, and you're like, it's a Monday, right? And students can empathize, and I'll have students say, yeah, it's a Monday, and all of this happens. And I think more and more, especially as we are working online, but having to transition back and maybe juggle a number of other responsibilities, just being aware of your own emotions and how they're impacting your interactions with students and your peers as well. And the last thing I kind of wanted to leave you with was that students look to us as the experts. And sometimes maybe we don't feel that way, but we really are the experts for them, right? We have all of those 3 competencies that NACADA suggests that we have. We have the informational, where we really know everything about the institution. And we are the experts to help them learn how to navigate their way through the advising process, the registration process, the graduation process, right? So don't forget about that when you're working with students, that they come to you as the experts. So think about how you're communicating with them. And in return, how then that affects your relationship or the rapport that you have with students. So that's really about it. So I have a slide for questions. I also provided my contact information. I think you all have it just as part of participating in these 3 days of events, which is great. But are there any questions that I can answer at this time? My PowerPoint also has references at the end. So if anybody is so inclined to want to read a little bit more, I have all of that for you as well. All right. So it's 1:03, we're a little early. Something in the chat, so thank you for putting my email in there. All right.
Nora, thank you
Yes.
so much for this really valuable information. I appreciate it. I guess I would say that having been an academic advisor and having, focused on transfer, this really resonates. What I am also thinking about is even my own institution. How can the institutional culture become more advising / EQ friendly? And that's a continuous challenge. We've come a long ways and we still have a long ways to go. So
I do appreciate that. I think that is key. And there's so many like competing needs and tasks and requirements, right? And so I feel like oftentimes advising is forgotten in terms of how key it is. I mean, all the research that I have gone through has suggested that advising is really the heart of retention, because that builds the relationships. And so I think sometimes it's overlooked. And sometimes there are institutions that really understand the impact that advising has. But I think the only thing that we well, not the only thing, but one of the things I guess that we can do is to continue these conversations, right? Is to continue having open lines of communication with other community colleges and other peers, as well as four-year institutions. And then even in how we do our websites, or how we provide information to students on our websites or on our printed collateral or advertising, right? Like we think about how we call, let's say, our center career and counseling at Delaware County, but sometimes that's not always clear to students that includes advising as well. So I think it's important that when we are providing directions to students, we're knowledgeable about how that might impact them. And I think this all comes down to emotional intelligence as well.
Yeah. No, I agree with everything that you said, but I also want to take that a step further, which is at our college, we've worked a lot on academic advising because we needed to. But now many of our faculty members, instead of taking responsibility for just the basic conversations, will send students to advising. So it's also, in my mind, more like the institution has to take maybe not the information aspect of it, but the spirit of the, of what advising and the EQ part of it, right? So everyone can be a little bit of an advisor, coach, support, mentor, whatever, even if it's in their own little way. And so, just that's where I would like the rest of the institution to see what you've presented as their own as well.
No, I agree with you. Absolutely. I mean, people need to take responsibility of that in their interactions. And like you said, sometimes it's a little thing, that conversation in the hallway, right? Like the student has you as a professor in a class, they stop you in the hallway. How are you interacting with them, right? Like, how is your body language? How is your self-awareness in that situation? If you're running from one class to another, for example, how are you interacting with that student? And so absolutely. And I think some of that comes with professional development. Sometimes we don't realize what we don't realize, or we don't know what we don't know. And kind of making people aware might help kind of, just turn the light bulb a little bit.
Great presentation.
Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts? Appreciate everybody sitting through this presentation. And I hope that you're able to take something away, even if it's that one or two, little nugget of information that you can apply in your interactions with students, even peers. Folks that you live with or neighbors or whatever it is, I think it's important too, not just necessarily in higher ed. So, well, if nothing else, thank you all for coming. Appreciate your time. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or want to have a further discussion. I'm more than happy to do that. So thank you all for coming. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.